Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Nikita Udwani. Before we start, I'd like to do a quick audio video check. Can you please use the chat box to let me know if you can hear and see me? Yes, thank you, Yelitsa. There we go. So, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this very special webinar today. I think, as you saw in the title, and I think that's also why you signed up for today's webinar. This week it will be 1 year since the invasion in Ukraine began, and we wanted to take the opportunity to have a webinar around to hear from you if you were involved in this response, to understand your challenges. We've also been talking to fleet managers throughout the last few months, and also in preparation for this webinar. So in the next 30 minutes, we'll be looking at what lessons did we learn from this emergency? What were some of the takeaways? How can we as fleet managers be better prepared for future emergencies? These are the topics we will be discussing today. To make it, as we are recording the webinar, we will post the webinar recording, and to make it as interactive as possible. It is a webinar after all, but I would love to hear from you. So I would like to ask you to use the chat box firstly to introduce yourself, and that includes your name, which organization you're working for, and which country you're calling in from today. So if you can use the chat box, I see we already have 50 people in this session today. It would be great if you can introduce yourself. There we go. I see some starting already. Thank you, Hassan. Fantastic. So please introduce yourself. But also, I have prepared some questions for you today, and I would like to. I'll actually be starting with the questions for you today. Please use the chat box. I'm watching it. I want to hear what you have to say. And throughout the webinar, in case you have any questions or comments, use the chat box for the same. We will be picking up your questions at the end of the webinar. Yes. So let's begin. I have a question for you to start with. I saw quite a number of signups, and also looking at the chat box, I see you are calling in from all different parts of the world. But I also see we have some colleagues who are, I think, who seem, at least from where you're based, you might have been involved in the first response to the Ukraine emergency. So indeed, for those of you who are on the line today, who have been involved in the emergency response, I would like to ask you, can you please share with us, those of you who have been involved in the response, can you please share with us what you learned from this? What were some of your key takeaways? I'm going to be keeping an eye out on the chat box as you type those. And in the meantime, I'm also going to share with you some of the responses we received from one-on-one conversations with fleet managers. But just a reminder, for those of you who have been involved in the response, please use the chat box. Please share some of your takeaways with us. Let's take a look at some of the things we heard in the last few months and in preparation for this webinar. I've prepared 5 key quotes that I think really stayed with me. The first one, and I think this is perhaps quite unique to the response in Ukraine. And just to be clear, when I say the response in Ukraine, I don't only mean in the country, but all the neighboring countries that were involved as well. So one of the first things we heard from many of our member organizations is we didn't have offices in the country or in the region, and we had to learn a lot at the start, from how do we register, taking into consideration import-export controls, all these different things. It took a while to get started. That is one of the first things that we heard from many organizations. The other thing we heard was, and I think Yelitsa is already pointing to this, is the vehicles we usually acquire for emergency response. This time they didn't meet the country standards, and that hindered us, and we couldn't respond as swiftly. And I see Yelitsa's mentioning goal, for example, refers to this with, we had a challenge with renting vehicles in Ukraine. If we rented a vehicle in Poland, it could not pass to Ukraine, and there were challenges around this. Another thing we heard is, okay, we did use a rental company, but then and we hired them really quickly, and by quickly I mean the paperwork was done quickly, but also enough time was not taken to ensure that the drivers working for the rental company and all the other staff around it, that they were familiar with the organization's procedures. And down the line, so 2 months later, they had to deal with a number of safeguarding incidences. Yeah. Which of course, given the nature of our activities, it's already such a tense environment. There are so many different things going on. The last thing you need is to be creating harm, right? Your staff members, or even your service providers, in this case the rental company, that they are creating harmful situations. It goes against the very grain of the purpose that you are there to support an emergency response. Another thing we heard was, given the security context and in the active conflict areas, we heard some organizations saying, okay, I used armored vehicles, I didn't arrange sensitization training, like to become, by sensitization I mean to become familiar with the armored vehicle. I didn't arrange those sessions for my passengers, and so they were doing a number of things happened. Sometimes they would leave the door open, they didn't know certain things about the windows and the windshields, and this had an impact on the wear and tear of the vehicles. I see another one. I'm picking up at the things that you're mentioning, colleagues. I really appreciate that you're sharing some of these. So I see some more. Yes, drivers were not trained to drive in the war situation. So maybe they knew how to drive, but it's different to be operating in an emergency. It's particularly one where there is a war, right? And your drivers were not trained for that. Okay. I see another colleague from DRC. Suzanne, thank you. You say, okay, we had an office since 2014. You were involved, okay, and you have been importing vehicles, and a bit of that challenge has to do with how to do the registration in the right way. Exactly, right? So these are some of the common themes that we hear when we talk to colleagues who were involved in the response. But also, we had a shortage of drivers, and we overworked our drivers, and as a result we had a number of accidents or crashes, as we call it in fleet forum, and potentially being tired had to do, was part of the causes. So this is what we heard from many of the fleet managers we spoke to. And if I look at the chat box, I see a number of you are agreeing and you resonate with this and you have more to share around this. So let's see now, what does that, what you can do when you are a fleet manager in an emergency response, right? Or even if you are in a country that's prone to disasters. So my first question to you all actually is, have you conducted an emergency transport needs assessment for your operation in the past 12 months? I want to ask you this question again to all of you in the chat today. Have you conducted an emergency transport needs assessment for your operation in the past 12 months? And if you could please use the chat box to say yes or no, I would be really curious to hear your responses. I see some Kennedy based in Kenya. There we go. I see a lot of people saying no, no, no. Amy, you saying Amy, another talent pool for qualified drivers? Yes. Okay. Guillaume, I see yes. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of no's and with some occasional yeses, which is giving me some hope, right? Not yet. That's the spirit, Timothy. Thank you. So what I want to discuss with you is, okay, because I want to make sure that this message is also relevant for many of you in this webinar today, right? So we're going to be talking about an emergency transport needs assessment and how you run this now, and this is applicable for organizations who were involved in the Ukrainian response, because what was unique about this was many of us were not registered there. We didn't know the many of the rules to operate there. So we had to do this very quickly, right? Hit the ground running, as we say in English. But for those of you who are based in other countries, this is an exercise that we encourage you to do on a yearly basis. And I'm going to, there we go. I see one. We have done one during mass casualty incident in Kenya. Thank you, Victor. So, but what I'm going to be doing today is walking you through the steps of an emergency transport needs assessment. Okay. So let's start. There's 4 parts to it. And the first two are really the ones where you have to work closely with your colleagues who are working in programs, because at the end, I mean, fleet managers, we are a support function, right? We are a supporter, an enabler, a facilitator of our organization's mission. But it starts with what are the activities of the organization? What is it going to do, right? So we'll go more into what are our relief activities, what external factors may hinder or facilitate our fleet operations, what are the operational needs, and what is the available capacity, right? So these are the 4 topics that we're going to be going through today. Let's first start with what are our relief activities. And like I said, fleet managers who are on the line today, here, this is not so much, this is not something that you will lead, but you need answers to these questions in order to be able to look at the capacity of your fleet. So this requires sitting together with your program colleagues, and I've just listed down some questions here, right? Especially those of you who you are working in a country where there is no emergency at the moment, but you need to plan ahead. You can use these questions to get a shape of what are the relief activities. So in this country, have we responded to an emergency before? Have we been affected by a disaster? What types of disasters are we vulnerable to? How many people do we think that would be affected? And what would be the role of our organization in this response? Would we help build shelters? Is our mission more about looking after the rights of children or women? This is really looking at what emergencies do we think might occur in our context, and what would that mean then for the activities and the support that we would provide in the response. So that is the first question we need to look at. The second one has to do with what external factors may hinder or facilitate our emergency response, and particularly the fleet operations part of it. So what I mean with this is, we advise you to look at the political, the economic, the social, the technological, environmental, and legal factors, and how this will affect you. Let's take some examples, right? And if I look at the Ukraine response, already some of these we will see. If we talk about like political response, so are there trade restrictions? Are there tariffs? These are, what are the import regulations in the country? This is a key part, right, that we hear from many of our colleagues in the Ukraine response, and I hear some of you on the line today as well. So you need to think about what are the trade restrictions, but also what are the labor laws. This will have an impact potentially on the drivers that you appoint. Something to think about as well is, can political insecurity present risks as well to certain routes? Will there be movement restrictions after daylight hours? This is really on the political part, right? Then comes the economic aspect. So will the exchange rate influence our procurement? What will it have? What impact will it have on the availability and the price of fuel? In terms of social, what we need to think about is, can certain ethnicities be targeted as a result of the crisis? What will this mean for the drivers that we appoint and how they move from one zone of the country to another? Another aspect is the technological, which is what means of communication are available in the country. Are they vulnerable to collapse during an emergency? But also the environmental, right? Another one that we saw quite so much in I think in the context of Ukraine. I'm not sure if you all saw last year, towards the end of the year, we facilitated a webinar around driving in wintry conditions. And I must be honest, it was the first one that we facilitated in Fleet Forum. And this was given the fact that there was a response in Ukraine, and that it is a country where there is seasonal weather, and that includes quite some serious winters, right? So you also have to look at the environmental factors when it comes to the emergency response. Um, let's take, I see some more challenges coming in. Thank you, Ludovic. Indeed, as you mentioned, you're constantly assessing the situation, yes, and sourcing of armored vehicles is a lengthy process, right? And you face issues around the import and registration, and this is time and time again a part that we hear from colleagues who were participating in the response, and you see this reflected also in the fourth aspect of the emergency transport needs assessment. So let's move on now to the third part of it, because we've covered what are relief activities and what are the external factors that can facilitate or hinder our fleet operations. Let's now look more and more at the operational needs. This is the moment where we start switching gears in the transport needs assessment. And the first part, the program colleagues are really leading and explaining what this would mean for the organization. But more and more as the fleet manager, then you will be involved in what are the external factors, but even more so in then what are the operational or transport needs, right? And here we advise you to break it down into two parts. First, look at what configurations of vehicles are needed, and that has to do with thinking about what will be the condition of the roads where we are driving. What will that mean for the potentially for the types of vehicles, but also how long are the journeys expected to be, right? And then go into the second part of it, which would be what vehicles will be used for this type of operation, and how many would we potentially need. You are the how many part is easiest to answer when you are at the start of the emergency and you can start making a calculation of it. If you are doing this as an annual exercise, what we encourage you to do then is to think, what if I needed to double the size or triple the size of my current fleet, and to start thinking on that basis. And now we come to the final step in the emergency transport needs assessment, and this has to do with what is the available capacity. And here, this is really quite an extensive piece that you have to cover, because when we say fleet capacity, we're not only talking about the vehicles itself, right? But we talk about fleet management capacity, which has to do with drivers, has to do with fuel, maintenance, but also the fleet manager capacity. Let's take these one step at a time, right? Now, for those of you who are at the start of the response and you do this exercise, this needs to be a fairly compact exercise, and you're in a way you're doing multiple steps at once, right? You're assessing the needs, you're also looking at your available capacity, and you are already acquiring the additional capacity you need. For those of you who are doing this to be proactive and to already have a plan in case there is an emergency in your country, my message to you is, of course, you cannot buy or rent additional vehicles. That's also not very cost efficient, right? But this is about thinking ahead. How can you access capacity if and when an emergency would occur? So in terms of vehicles, you've got to think, okay, would I buy? Would I rent? Do I would I if I'm buying, would I buy locally or would I import? And to also, as you are seeing from the colleagues who are on the line today, who are telling you there's a lot of issue, what they've learned from this emergency is there's a lot of issues around the process of importation and registration. You cannot take away all those issues, but you can at least make sure to be as knowledgeable about the process in advance. And that means doing your research, understanding the local restrictions, but also talking to other organizations and learning from their experience, right? So one part is about how can we acquire more vehicles. Another part then has to do with how can we hire competent drivers. And I'm going to be sharing with you some of the practices that we've learned from other organizations. But please keep in mind, the question is framed in the context of hiring, but it's also making sure that these drivers have the right capacity. As Yelitsa was mentioning before, you might have drivers who are competent, who know the roads, but they are also working in an environment, maybe in a war, they might be responding to a man-made emergency like a war, and that is also very sensitive, and they have to know how to deal with that type of context. So training is also a big piece of this part. Who can maintain the vehicles? Which facilities? looking at your how are you going to get spare parts, maybe depending on how remote the country is, would you consider using a mobile workshop? This is what you've got to think of in terms of your maintenance facilities. Moving on to fuel, planning out, okay, making a map of where are the fuel stations, what might happen potentially to the quality of the fuel, what payment methods would be easiest and smoothest and fastest in the moment. And then lastly, looking at who can manage the fleet. Do we have a contingency plan? How will we communicate with programs? What types of sensitization training for passengers would we have? So the more you can think about these things in advance, the better prepared you are then for an emergency. Um, Prior to this webinar, Fleet Forum, over the years, we've been developing a guide, because I see one of you asked, do you have an electronic checklist? We do. We'll make sure to share the guide with you. But we also reached out to a number of organizations to find out what were their good practices in the Ukraine response. And those of you who are on the line, so Simon, Yulitsa, but I've seen Ludo. I didn't memorize all the names. My apologies, Susan as well, and there's several of you as well, several more as well. Can I please ask you as well to share in the chat box what are some of your good practices, or where you think, okay, by implementing this specific action, we were able to better respond? I'd be curious to hear what you have to say. I've also compiled a list. What I hear from organizations is, you've got to use your next rental tender to pre-select some more vehicle rental providers, and as much as possible try to pre-negotiate rates. I've heard some organizations say create an emergency driver database or a roster, or reach out to a staffing company who can supply drivers, or contact a professional driving school, and agree that they will recommend drivers if an emergency occurs. Standardizing your vehicles as much as possible, so that you can make sure that the drivers don't have to take all different types of trainings, but also identifying a backup maintenance provider. So you might have a contract with one today, but maybe consider having a backup provider, where possible. I understand it's not possible all the time, but if it is, set up an agreement with the fuel station, to have an authorized card or a coupon system, something that can go faster, especially when time is of the essence in an emergency. But also some more things like identify a driver training provider, include topics in your ongoing training, identify 2 local staff members who can take on the fleet manager role in the case of an emergency. Set up vehicle sharing. I see one, I think it was Amy, you mentioned interagency effort, right? So this is one of the things we heard from organizations. Set up a vehicle sharing collaboration with other NGOs to pool your resources and share vehicles at the start of an emergency. And lastly, brief your rental vehicle companies at the start. Make sure you do your sensitization training, so that it's clear to them what your standards are, right? And set up weekly performance monitoring meetings, especially in the first few weeks or months of the emergency response. I see some more. If you have put it in the chat box in the meantime, let's go through them. Let me see. You might have competent drivers, but communication, meaning local language, could be a challenge indeed, right? So making sure that, especially if it is a country where there is different, ethnicities, and there's friction or tension between that, to make sure that your drivers are aware of these, that they're able to move from one area to the other. I see, Simon, you say for those not used to managing AVs, the supply chains for those can be tricky and expensive. Exactly. Maybe it's a tip for some of the fleet managers on the line today, especially if today you are not operating armored vehicles, but you are in a country that could be prone or could be vulnerable to a war, or you're close to a conflict area, to start educating yourself, right, on armored vehicle fleet management, so that you're prepared for that in the future. Yulitsa, I see you wrote, in the end, we have hired an escort company, all in one, security, AV, competent driver. Okay, it's also a way forward on this. Good to use other agencies, driver talent pool, and the hired vehicles. coordination with government agencies who are active in the response, right? I appreciate that you mentioned that one, Roshan. What I have not included here, but it's indeed a good practice, is participate in the meetings where other agencies are all coming together, right, and sharing information. There's a reason why there is a we have yeah, how do you say, mechanisms like the logistics cluster, and the concept of a cluster to bring us together and share and exchange information quickly between organizations, right? You need to set up a command center where all the activities will be monitored. There we go. I'm seeing quite a number of different things pop up, right? So, and but also some really good questions. And I see we have 5 minutes left. So why not let's move on into the Q&A part of the webinar. Mufaro, I answered your question already. I think this is in reference to some of the slides we shared today, right? And if we have an electronic checklist, we do. It's on our knowledge platform. We will make sure to yeah, to circulate that once we send the recording of the webinar as well. Liamba, question from you: how do you come up with the right number of drivers to avert the issue of workload? And I think there was a colleague already who started to answer your question. Kennedy said, analyze your movement activities, then set up a shift schedule to ensure that drivers work within the recommended work hours, right? There we go. Maybe it's a future, I appreciate that you raised the question though, Liam, but maybe it's a future topic for one of our webinars. We make a note of it as well. And what I would recommend, if you're interested in it, is we have a specialization in our fleet management trainings around fatigue management, both for drivers but also for managers. And on the manager side, we really pay attention to things like the biorhythm. How do you like, yeah, how do you know, the sleep cycles, nutrition, but how do you also plan a shift schedule accordingly? So do take a note of that. Is there any driver type of stress management program implemented? Not to my knowledge, but again, you're giving us some good food for thought today as well. It's the beauty of the webinars. Carlos, let me check for you, to be honest. I've seen things like I mentioned, we offer something around fatigue management, but I do think that's different. We're talking about different things here, right? It's in the area of driver wellness, but it's not quite the same. Let me check. We might look in with some of our member organizations and find a good practice. And if it's not there, maybe we can start investigating how deep is the need and who might we collaborate with on this one. Will you share the electronic checklist? I think I answered this question already. Yes, we will. And then I see some of you sharing some practices. Let me just share some of them as well. We build capacity to AV driver training of trainers. There we go. So TOTs can be great resources. And if you connect with WHO, I'm not saying Ludo is offering the TOT, but he has a trained resource. This is part of interagency collaboration, share with each other, talk to each other as well. But Ludo, I appreciate that you share that, right? It's not possible maybe to bring everybody together in one spot, especially during an emergency. So having a trainer who can then move around and have some of those trainers go and slowly train all the different people, that is definitely one way to go about it, right? I see, let's pick up a couple more questions. Timothy, you say, I don't see infrastructure as a factor that may hinder or facilitate fleet operations. I disagree with you. I mean, maybe we have a different definition of infrastructure, right? But I'm referring to like the road conditions, which roads are available to that you can move on if there's going to be certain, blockages, and to think about that, right? So, we might have a difference of opinion here. Ludo, another one, would be good to meet with people on the ground to share ideas and challenges. Ludo, I love that you're mentioning this. To be honest, we haven't announced this yet, but we are in the background trying to organize a training to support the Ukraine response. I will touch base with you separately. Maybe there are areas that we can discuss and see how we can build on your idea. One more minute to go. Oh, Suzanne gave a resource for stress management for drivers. This is why I like the interaction in the webinars. And I see we are running out of time, colleagues. So I just want to wrap up by saying, few things. First of all, thank you all for joining this webinar today. I hope you learned something from it. I hope you took out something for it. Thank you for being so interactive and sharing your experiences around this. I think we've all walked away with some good ideas, and also some food for thought for myself. So thank you as well for that. My key message to you here is that if you start to set up fleet management with in the case of Ukraine, many of us did not have offices there, so we had to do our emergency transport needs assessment very quickly and move fast, quickly. And but many of us who are on the line today are in countries where there isn't an emergency at the moment, but you never know, there could be. So, my call to action to all of us on the line is please make sure that many of those who said no to have you done an emergency transport needs assessment in the last 12 months, that in 2023 you change that to a yes. And we will share the checklist to assist you with that. I want to thank you all for participating once again today, and please join us next week, where we are going to be talking about how you can stay focused on your fleet management priorities. Thank you all. Have a great day.